It was an evening like any other. The city's streetlights bathed the bustling downtown in a warm, steady glow. People shuffled along the sidewalks, engrossed in their own lives, oblivious to the tension about to unfold just a few blocks away. Jamal West, dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, guided his luxury sedan smoothly through traffic. The car was a symbol of success, a statement that this black man, in a world where odds were often stacked against him, had carved out his place. But to some, it was a beacon of defiance, a reminder that not everyone belonged in their preconceived boxes. The red and blue lights flashed suddenly in his rearview mirror, and Jamal's stomach clenched. He signaled and eased the car over to the curb, his thoughts racing. He had committed no traffic violation, had been careful with his speed, signaled every turn. He knew these streets better than most. This was home. As he rolled down his window, the cool evening air carried the scent of tension. Officers Riley and Jenkins approached, their faces shadowed under the brims of their caps. Even before they spoke, Jamal could feel it, that silent, simmering hostility that often lingered in these encounters. It was the look of authority, tinged with a predatory gleam, the kind that made your skin crawl, even when you had done nothing wrong. Evening, Officer Jamal began, keeping his tone polite but neutral. Years of experience had taught him to be calm, respectful, and above all, careful. The wrong word, the wrong movement, and things could escalate in a heartbeat. License and registration, Riley barked, ignoring the greeting. His eyes flitted to Jamal's car, sleek, immaculate, a brand that screamed success. Too much success for a man like you, his gaze seemed to say. Jamal handed over his documents without hesitation. The silence stretched as Riley scrutinized the papers, flipping them over as if searching for some hidden clue, something to justify the stop. Meanwhile, Jenkins circled the car slowly, his eyes narrowed, his hand resting casually on his holster. "What are you doing in this part of town?" Riley asked finally, his voice dripping with suspicion. The question hit Jamal like a slap. This was where he lived, where he had bought a house, where he contributed to the community. But none of that mattered right now. "Just heading home," Sir Jamal replied evenly. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. Any sign of irritation would be read as defiance, any protest as aggression. He knew this script too well. The officers exchanged a glance. To them, the answers didn't matter. Jamal's demeanor didn't matter. All that mattered was their assumption a black man in a nice car in a predominantly white neighborhood. The very sight of him was an affront to their sense of order. Without another word, Riley motioned for Jenkins to join him. "Step out of the vehicle," Jenkins ordered brusquely. A dozen thoughts rushed through Jamal's mind. Was he being arrested? What grounds did they have? He could argue, he could resist, but he knew where that path led. So he did as he was told, slowly, deliberately. Hands visible at all times. The cuffs came next cold, metal biting into his wrists, stripping him of dignity. "What's the charge?" Officer Jamal asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. There was no charge, no reason. The officer's silence spoke volumes. This wasn't about law enforcement. It was about power, about showing a successful black man that no matter his achievements, he could still be brought low. With a rough shove, they guided him into the back of the squad car. The world outside blurred as they sped through the streets. He caught glimpses of people staring, phones out, recording. Whispers spread, voices rose, but the officers ignored it all. They had made their catch. At the station, the routine unfolded with mechanical precision. His belongings were confiscated, pockets emptied. The officers' indifference chilled him as they processed him like any other suspect. But Jamal remained composed, his gaze steady. The very stillness of him seemed to unnerve Jenkins. "Who do you think you are?" Jenkins sneered, hovering over Jamal as if hoping to provoke a reaction. Jamal lifted his eyes slowly, meeting Jenkins' stare without a flicker of emotion. "Just a man trying to get home," he replied simply. But there was something in his tone that made Jenkins bristle, a calmness that suggested he wasn't just another man in cuffs. Jamal's reputation had often preceded him, but in this small precinct, his name was still unknown. That wouldn't last for long. The holding cell was cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the life Jamal had built. But he remained patient, watching as Riley and Jenkins stood outside, smirking. They had no idea who he was yet. It was Officer O'Brien, a junior officer on the night shift, who first recognized him. He had seen Jamal in the papers, on television, speaking out against police misconduct, winning high-profile cases. He had read about the lawsuits Jamal filed, the settlements he won, the reforms he pushed for. The man in the cell wasn't just anyone. He was Jamal West, the civil rights lawyer who had made a career out of holding people like Riley and Jenkins accountable. "Holy, that's Jamal West," O'Brien whispered, eyes wide. Riley turned, frowning. "Who?" "Jamal West, man, the guy who exposed that corruption ring last year. He's a damn legend. This is a big deal." The color drained from Riley's face as he glanced back at Jamal. The lawyer's calm expression hadn't changed, but now, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Riley saw him differently. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was a threat not to their safety, but to their careers, their precinct, their very way of operating. "Shit," Jenkins muttered, realizing the gravity of their situation. "What do we do?" But it was too late. The news had already started spreading. O'Brien, unable to keep the revelation to himself, had shared it with a few colleagues, and soon the whole station was buzzing. By the time the police chief Daniels arrived, reporters were already outside, cameras flashing, voices raised. "Get him out of there," Daniels hissed, eyes blazing. "Now." But Jamal wasn't moving, not until his demands were met. He wanted an apology, wanted the charges dropped, and he wanted every moment of his wrongful arrest documented and exposed. He would take this all the way not just for himself, but for every black man who had been humiliated, threatened, or worse because of the color of his skin. The night that started with flashing lights and a routine stop would end in a media storm. Jamal West, the man they tried to silence, would once again become the voice that shattered their lives. And this time the world was watching. The revelation of Jamal West's identity spread like wildfire, igniting a spark of indignation that reverberated far beyond the four walls of the precinct. What began as hushed whispers among officers within the station soon spilled out into the community, taking on a life of its own. It started with a single tweet, a video clip of Jamal being shoved into the back of a police car, his face obscured, but his voice clear and unwavering as he stated his name. "I am Jamal West, and I know my rights." Within minutes, that video found its way to hundreds, then thousands of screens. The online world reacted first, furious comments, hashtags trending within the hour, and calls to action from activists who had been waiting for an opportunity to confront the systemic injustices plaguing their neighborhoods. "Justice for Jamal," "Stand with West," "Racial profiling is real," these became rallying cries that echoed across social media platforms. But it wasn't just an online uproar. The fury of the digital world translated swiftly into reality as people began to gather outside the police station. It started small, a few dozen, holding signs that read, "Racial profiling is not policing and hands off our rights." The group included familiar faces from local civil rights groups, leaders who had marched for years against police brutality, but also newcomers young and old, men and women from every walk of life. Then the news crews arrived. Reporters and camera operators from all the major networks pushed through the crowd, jostling for the best angle. Bright lights illuminated the gathering night, casting sharp shadows on the protesters' faces. Microphones bobbed up and down as journalists tried to capture the raw emotion that was building. "Why are you here tonight?" one reporter asked an elderly woman clutching a sign that read, "Enough is enough." Her voice shook with barely contained rage, because this has gone on for too long. Jamal West is a respected lawyer. If they can do this to him, what chance does any of us have? Another camera turned to a young man, his eyes fierce. "We're here because we're tired," he said. "Tired of being afraid? Tired of being harassed just for existing? Today it's Jamal. Tomorrow it could be me, or my brother, or my son." The crowd swelled as more people arrived. Some came alone, others in groups. Families held hands, parents with their children perched on their shoulders, each new arrival adding to the sense of unity, of shared purpose. The protest moved from the sidewalks onto the street, voices rising in a chorus that reverberated through the city. "No justice, no peace," they chanted. "Free Jamal now." Inside the precinct, officers watched nervously from behind the glass windows. They could see the signs, the fists raised in defiance, the throng of people pressing closer and closer to entrance. The tension in the room was palpable. Chief Daniels paced back and forth, barking orders into his phone, his face flushed with stress. What was supposed to be a simple, routine stop had exploded into a full-blown PR crisis. "Get him to disperse," he snapped at his subordinates. But there was no turning back now. This was bigger than a traffic stop, bigger than Jamal West. This was about every unjustified arrest, every moment of humiliation, every act of racial profiling that had gone unchecked. The people weren't leaving until they saw change. And then the news anchor's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Breaking news," she announced, her expression somber. Jamal West, a prominent civil rights attorney known for his legal victories against police misconduct, has been wrongfully detained by the local police department. Reports indicate that West was arrested without cause and subjected to racially motivated mistreatment. Protesters are now gathered outside the station, demanding his immediate release. The broadcast was picked up by every major news channel. From coast to coast, households tuned in to see the unfolding events. Viewers watched as aerial shots showed the growing crowd as camera crews zoomed in on the faces of the protesters, faces of all colors and backgrounds united by their shared outrage. Interviews with community leaders aired back to back. "This isn't just about Jamal," one activist stated firmly, glaring into the camera. "This is about every black man who has been stopped and frisked for no reason. Every Latino who has been pulled over because of the way he looks. Every marginalized person who has been treated as less than human by those sworn to protect us. Enough is enough." The pressure mounted. Politicians began weighing in. Statements of support for Jamal flooded in from congressmen, governors, and even a few presidential hopefuls. They condemned the actions of the officers involved, calling for investigations for accountability. Public figures tweeted their outrage. Celebrities took to Instagram to express solidarity. It seemed the entire nation was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside his cell, Jamal could hear the chants growing louder. He couldn't see the crowd, but he could feel their presence, their power, and he smiled. This was more than he could have hoped for. They weren't just demanding his freedom, they were demanding justice, demanding change. Hours passed and still the crowd refused to disperse. They stayed, undeterred by the chill of the night, by the threats of arrest. Some knelt in prayer, others sang songs of hope and resistance. And through it all, The media continued to broadcast live, capturing every moment, every tear, every cry for justice. By midnight, the situation had reached a boiling point. The mayor called a press conference, his face pale and drawn. "The wrongful detention of Mr. Jamal West is a grave error," he said slowly, the words grudgingly forced out. "I have spoken with Chief Daniels and we are working to rectify this situation immediately. Mr. West will be released and a full investigation will be launched." A cheer erupted from the crowd as the announcement played over loudspeakers. But it wasn't just a cheer of relief, it was a cheer of triumph. They had been heard, they had won, at least for now. Minutes later, Jamal emerged from the precinct, his head held high, the cuffs finally gone. The crowd roared as he stepped onto the sidewalk, their chants reverberating through the night. Reporters swarmed around him, cameras flashing, but he raised a hand for silence. "This is not the end," he said, his voice steady and clear. "This is just the beginning. We are not done fighting. We will not be silent. Not until every person in this city, in this country, can walk the streets without fear." And as the crowd chanted his name, Jamal West, the man they tried to silence, stood tall, not just a victim, not just a lawyer, but a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope. And the world, watching through their screens, knew that this was a moment they would never forget. After his release, Jamal West didn't go home to rest. The ordeal had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. This wasn't just about his own wrongful detention, it was about something much larger. He knew that there were countless others who would never have the privilege of a public outcry, whose names would never be known. For every Jamal West, there were hundreds of faceless victims, people who had been silenced, whose stories were buried in police reports and ignored by the system. This time, he vowed, things would be different. Standing on the steps of City Hall the morning after his release, Jamal addressed a sea of supporters, activists, and reporters. Camera lenses focused in, microphones hovered close, and the crowd, now numbering in the hundreds, waited with bated breath. The anger from the night before had not subsided, it had evolved into something deeper, a collective determination that crackled in the crisp morning air. "We cannot afford to let this moment pass," Jamal began, his voice ringing out clear and strong. He wore no suit today, no symbols of success. Instead, he stood in a simple shirt, sleeves rolled up, as if ready to get to work. His presence radiated a quiet power, one that made even those who didn't know him lean in and listen. "We are here not just because of what happened to me, but because of what has been happening for decades: unchecked abuse of power, racial profiling, and a complete lack of accountability. The fact that I was released so quickly was not a victory for justice. It was a sign of how much power lies in visibility. But what about those who are not lawyers, not in the public eye? What about them?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jamal's eyes swept over them, seeing not just faces, but the potential for change. "We cannot just protest. We must act. We must demand change at the very foundation of the system. And that change starts with oversight." With those words, Jamal laid out his vision: the establishment of an independent police oversight committee, a body separate from the police department, composed of community leaders, legal experts, and activists. The goal was clear: to monitor, investigate, and hold accountable every action taken by those sworn to protect and serve. "Transparency and justice," Jamal declared, his gaze steady. "That is what we demand. And we will not stop until we have it." The crowd erupted into cheers, fists pumping the air, voices blending into a roar that echoed through the city streets. But amid the celebration, Jamal knew that the real battle was only beginning. Change would not come easily. The entrenched power structures within the police department would not bend without a fight. As expected, the backlash was swift and ruthless. From the moment the city council began discussions on the establishment of the oversight committee, the police union launched an aggressive counter-campaign. They framed the proposal as an attack on law enforcement, painting Jamal as an enemy of public safety. Anonymous sources began leaking misinformation to the press, alleging that Jamal had a criminal history or ties to radical groups. Talk radio hosts and conservative pundits picked up the narrative, amplifying it until Jamal's name became synonymous with controversy. But Jamal had faced worse. He didn't flinch. With the support of community leaders, he held public forums, town hall meetings, and even appeared on national television, calmly refuting every baseless claim. He shared his story not just of that night, but of the countless cases he had handled, the people he had defended, the lives he had seen ruined by unchecked power. "This is not about hating the police," Jamal would say over and over. "This is about loving justice. It's about ensuring that the people who are supposed to protect us do so with honor and integrity." His message resonated. People from all walks of life began to rally behind him: young activists and seasoned civil rights leaders, mothers who had lost sons to police violence, fathers who had been harassed just for existing. They formed coalitions, grassroots organizations, and advocacy groups. Soon, it wasn't just a movement for oversight, it was a movement for change. The pressure mounted. As public support for the oversight committee grew, city officials found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. They couldn't ignore the demands of the people. Finally, under mounting scrutiny and facing the threat of mass demonstrations, the city council passed a resolution: the independent police oversight committee would be established. The victory was celebrated across the city, but for Jamal, it was bittersweet. He knew that creating the committee was just the first step. The real work lay ahead. The police union immediately filed legal challenges, seeking to undermine the committee's authority. They flooded local media with stories of police officers feeling betrayed and unsupported behind closed doors. Senior officers plotted ways to sabotage the committee's efforts, making it clear that any attempt to curb their power would be met with fierce resistance. The smear campaign against Jamal escalated. Someone leaked his personal information online, putting his family at risk. Anonymous threats arrived at his office, his home. But through it all, Jamal stood firm. Every attack, every attempt to discredit him, only fueled his determination. This is what change looks like, he told a reporter during one particularly intense week. It's ugly, it's painful, and it's hard, but if we're not willing to endure this, then we are not ready for the kind of justice we say we want. The months that followed were grueling. The committee, once established, faced roadblocks at every turn. Police officers refused to cooperate with investigations, evidence mysteriously went missing, and political pressure mounted to disband the group altogether. But Jamal and his allies persevered. They documented every obstruction, held press conferences to expose every underhanded tactic, and rallied the community to stand with them. Slowly, progress was made. A few officers were suspended for misconduct. A previously buried report on racial bias within the department was unearthed and published. The committee's work began to gain traction, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Jamal knew the road ahead was long. He knew that real change would take years, perhaps even decades. But as he stood before yet another crowd, speaking not as a victim, but as a leader, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond personal vindication. "We are not just fighting for oversight," he said that night, his voice carrying over the sea of faces lit by candlelight. "We are fighting for a world where justice is not a privilege, but a right, where no one fears the people who are supposed to protect them, and we will not stop until that world is a reality." The crowd roared in agreement, voices rising in a unified cry for justice. Jamal West had become more than a man, he was a movement. And that movement was just beginning. Titled "The Shadows of Opposition: Jamal West's Battle Against the Hidden Forces." Jamal West was no stranger to conflict. From the moment he began his campaign for justice, he expected resistance, but what he didn't anticipate was just how deep and sinister the opposition would run. The Independent Police Oversight Committee was barely a few months old when the first signs of trouble began to surface. At first, it was subtle reports mysteriously going missing, witnesses who suddenly changed their statements, and inexplicable delays in simple procedural matters. Then it escalated. One night, as Jamal sat alone in his office, poring over documents detailing the committee's early findings, his phone rang. The number was blocked. He hesitated, then picked up. A voice, low and chilling, spoke from the other end. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. West. Stop now while you still can." The line went dead before Jamal could respond. He stared at the phone, a cold knot forming in his stomach. It wasn't the first threat he'd received, but there was something different about this one. It felt calculated, deliberate, a warning laced with the promise of consequences. And this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the harassment intensified. Anonymous letters arrived at his office, each one more graphic and menacing than the last. His car tires were slashed in broad daylight. Rocks shattered the windows of his law firm. Members of the Oversight Committee also found themselves targeted, hacked emails, threatening messages, and personal information leaked online. Some members resigned, citing concerns for their family's safety. Others, however, dug in their heels, unwilling to be bullied into submission. Jamal suspected the resistance stemmed from within the police department itself, but as he and his closest ally, Marcus Stevens, a former detective with a sharp eye for detail and a history of challenging corruption, began to dig deeper, they uncovered something far more insidious. This wasn't just a few disgruntled officers resisting change. This was a coordinated effort, a campaign orchestrated by forces far more powerful. It was Marcus who first brought up the name Raymond Blackwood, a murmur in the shadows, a ghostly figure that few had ever seen, but whose presence was felt whenever there was something to be buried, someone to be silenced, or a system to be protected. Blackwood was a fixer, a man known for making problems disappear no matter the cost. Politicians, CEOs, and even some law enforcement officials had been rumored to call upon his services when the stakes were high and the consequences dire. But what sent chills down Jamal's spine wasn't Blackwood's reputation. It was the realization that this man wasn't working alone. The deeper they dug, the more connections they uncovered between the police department and local business magnates, between city council members and notorious crime syndicates. It became clear there was a network of powerful individuals all tied together by mutual interests and a shared fear of what true accountability could mean for them. Jamal leaned back in his chair one evening, the evidence spread out before him like pieces of a dark puzzle. "They're not just trying to stop us," he murmured to Marcus, "they're trying to destroy us." Marcus nodded grimly. "And they'll use every tool at their disposal to make sure we fail." Their suspicions were confirmed when a series of bank transactions unearthed by a whistleblower within the police department revealed that Blackwood had been receiving substantial payments from accounts linked to prominent figures in the city's elite. These figures weren't just opposing the Oversight Committee on principle, they were protecting something that Jamal and his team had inadvertently stumbled upon. The turning point came one night when Marcus received an encrypted message from a former colleague within the force. The message was brief, but it sent a jolt of fear through both men. "There is a hit on Jamal. He needs to leave. Now." Jamal stared at the words on the screen, his mind racing. A hit. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were coming for him. We need to go public, Marcus urged. If we expose what we know, it'll be harder for them to move against us. Right now, we're isolated. We need the people on our side. Jamal knew he was right. But going public meant risking everything, not just his own safety, but that of his family, his colleagues, everyone who had stood by him. He thought of the faces of those who had been targeted, of the community members who had placed their hope in the committee's work. And then he thought of Blackwood, somewhere out there in the darkness, pulling the strings. They want us to be afraid, Jamal said slowly, his voice steady despite the weight of the threat hanging over them. But fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. If they want to fight, then that's what they'll get. The next morning, Jamal called a press conference. He stood before the cameras, his face calm, his voice unwavering. He laid out everything, the harassment, the threats, the evidence they had gathered. He named names, listed the connections, and for the first time spoke publicly about Raymond Blackwood. There is a shadow organization at work here, Jamal declared, his gaze boring into the camera lenses. An organization that believes it is above the law, that thinks it can silence the voices of those who seek justice. But I am here to tell you, we see you, we know who you are, and we will not be intimidated. The reaction was explosive. The story dominated the headlines. Public outrage, already simmering, boiled over. Calls flooded into the mayor's office, demanding an investigation into the allegations. City officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, and whispers of resignation swirled around those implicated. The police chief, visibly shaken, announced a formal inquiry into the corruption allegations. But Jamal knew that this was only a temporary victory. Blackwood and his backers wouldn't go down without a fight. And he was right. Over the next few weeks, the backlash against Jamal intensified. His law firm was raided under dubious pretenses. His financial records were scrutinized, and fabricated scandals began to surface in the tabloids. The smear campaign against him reached new heights, painting him as a radical, a liar, even a criminal. Through it all, Jamal stood firm. He knew that the only way to win this battle was to shine a light so bright that even the darkest corners could not escape its reach. And so he continued to speak out, to organize, to push forward. The fight against Raymond Blackwood and the hidden forces controlling the city would be long and brutal, but Jamal West had something they didn't, the truth, and he was determined to wield it like a sword, cutting through the lies and deceit until justice, true justice, was finally served. Jamal West sat at the corner of the dimly lit bar, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hanging heavy in the air. The place was a far cry from the polished conference rooms and bustling streets where he usually found himself, but tonight he was stepping out of his comfort zone, venturing into the heart of the darkness that loomed over his fight for justice. A single light bulb swung lazily above his head, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The bar was mostly empty, a few solitary figures hunched over their drinks, lost in thought, and a lone bartender polishing glasses with a half-hearted focus. And then the door creaked open. A man slipped inside, his movements deliberate, his gaze sweeping the room with the sharp awareness of someone accustomed to danger. Dressed in a faded leather jacket and worn jeans, Crow was the type who blended into any setting, the kind of man you wouldn't notice until it was too late. Jamal tensed slightly as their eyes met, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Crow had been a ghost up until now, a faceless presence known only by his reputation. And that reputation was nothing short of lethal. Crow moved to the bar and settled onto the stool opposite Jamal, his expression unreadable. Up close, his face was lined and weathered, the eyes cold and calculating. There was a scar running down his left cheek, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. "You must be either brave or crazy to set up a meet like this," West Crow murmured, his voice low and gravelly. "You're a man with a lot of enemies right now." Jamal forced himself to hold Crow's gaze, willing himself not to flinch under the weight of it. "I'm not here to play games, Crow. I want the truth, and I know you have it." Crow let out a dry chuckle, leaning back slightly as if to assess the man in front of him. "The truth? The truth is dangerous, West. People who go looking for it usually end up in graves. Or they change the game," Jamal countered softly. "You and I both know that Blackwood doesn't care about people like you. You're just a pawn, used to do his dirty work, and then tossed aside when you're no longer useful." Crow's expression darkened, a flicker of something, anger, bitterness, or perhaps fear flashing in his eyes. Jamal had struck a nerve, and he knew it. "Is that why you wanted to meet?" Crow growled, leaning forward now, his gaze hard. "To lecture me on morality? You think I don't know what I am?" "No," Jamal said calmly, his voice steady. "I think you know exactly what you are, but I also think you're smart enough to see that Blackwood's plans are spiraling out of control. He's not just targeting me, he's targeting the entire oversight committee, the community, anyone who stands in his way. And when the dust settles, when everything blows up in his face, you'll be the one left holding the bag. You'll be the fall guy." Crow's jaw clenched, his fists tightening on the edge of the bar. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Jamal could see the battle playing out behind Crow's eyes, the instinct to protect himself warring with a lifetime of loyalty to the man who had given him power, purpose, and a place in the underbelly of the city's corruption. "You think you can scare me?" Crow hissed, but there was a trace of uncertainty in his tone now. "You think I'll just roll over and betray everything?" Jamal leaned forward, his gaze intense. I think you're tired, Crow. I think you've been in this game too long, and deep down, you know that Blackwood's promises are empty. He'll leave you out to dry, just like he's done to everyone else who got too close. Crow stared at him, breathing heavily, and then something shifted. The hardness in his eyes faltered, replaced by a glimmer of something more human, desperation, perhaps, or the faintest hint of regret. Blackwood's got plans, Crow muttered almost to himself. Big ones. He's not just trying to shut down your little oversight committee. He's got connections, real connections, cops, city officials, even a few judges. They're all in on it. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He forced himself to stay calm, to not betray the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. What kind of plans? Crow hesitated, glancing around the bar as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and slit his throat. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. There's going to be a push, a power grab. Blackwood's setting the stage for something big. He's been getting funds from some heavy hitters. They want to turn the oversight committee into a puppet, use it to legitimize their control over the police department. And once they do, they'll expand other cities, other states. This is just the beginning. Jamal's blood ran cold. He had known Blackwood was dangerous, but this was on a scale far beyond what he had imagined. If Blackwood succeeded, the entire concept of police oversight would become a farce, a tool for consolidating power rather than curbing it. Why are you telling me this? Jamal asked quietly, studying Crow's face. You know what Blackwood will do to you if he finds out you talk? Crow's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. Because you're right, Wes, I'm tired. I've done a lot of things in my life, hurt a lot of people. But this is going to hurt a whole lot more, and I'm not going down for it. Not this time. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Jamal tensed instinctively. But instead of a weapon, Crow pulled out a small, battered notebook. He slid it across the bar, his gaze locking onto Jamal's. Names, dates, locations, Crow murmured. Everyone who's been bought, everyone who's in Blackwood's pocket. It's not the full list, but it's enough to get you started. Use it, and maybe, just maybe, you'll have a chance to stop him. Jamal picked up the notebook, his fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the pages. The names leapt out at him, people he knew, people he had worked with, people he had thought were on the side of justice. It was worse than he had feared, but it was also a lifeline, a weapon in a war that had just gotten a whole lot darker. Thank you, Jamal said softly, meeting Crow's gaze. Don't thank me yet, Crow replied grimly. You've just stepped into a snake pit, West, and Blackwood's the biggest viper of them all. If you're going to take him down, you better be ready to lose everything. With that, Crow stood and walked out of the bar, disappearing into the night. Jamal sat there for a long moment, staring at the notebook in his hands. He had asked for the truth, and now he had it raw, ugly, and deadly. The stakes had just been raised. And if Jamal wanted to survive, he would have to be willing to risk it all. The fight against Blackwood was no longer just about the oversight committee. It was about the future of the city itself. And Jamal West, a man who had already lost so much, knew that he wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. Jamal West stood at the center of the packed conference room, the air charged with anticipation. The walls were lined with reporters, their cameras trained on him, lenses gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Every major news outlet had shown up, from local stations to national networks. The room buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that preceded the unveiling of something monumental, something that would change everything. Jamal took a deep breath, his heart pounding. In his hand was a folder, unremarkable in appearance, but holding inside it the weight of years of corruption, deceit, and betrayal. The contents of this folder had the power to shatter reputations, dismantle careers, and bring down some of the most powerful figures in the city. But more importantly, it had the potential to vindicate the countless voices that had been silenced, to expose the rot festering within the very institutions meant to uphold justice. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming, Jamal began, his voice steady despite the gravity of what was about to unfold. He glanced briefly at Marcus Stevens, who stood off to the side, his arms crossed, a look of grim determination on his face. Marcus had been there every step of the way, a steadfast ally in this war against an unseen enemy. Today, they would face that enemy head on. Today is not just about what happened to me, Jamal continued, his gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with the rows of journalists, activists, and community members who had gathered to witness this moment. It's about a system that has been corrupted from within. It's about a web of power that stretches from the highest offices of this city to the very streets we walk every day. He paused, letting the words sink in, watching as the room fell utterly silent. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the folder and began pulling out sheet after sheet of paper. What I am about to show you are documents, emails, recorded conversations, and sworn testimonies, all of which detail a coordinated effort by a group of individuals to undermine the rule of law and manipulate the system to their own advantage. The cameras clicked furiously as he held up the first document, an internal memo from the police department, marked confidential, outlining a strategy to suppress complaints against officers with known records of misconduct. This, Jamal said, is the tip of the iceberg. He moved on, displaying copies of emails exchanged between high-ranking police officers and city officials, discussing how to quash investigations into illegal practices, how to discredit whistleblowers, and how to protect certain business interests. Each page told a story of betrayal and greed, each message dripping with arrogance and impunity. But it was when he revealed the signed statements from Crow, Blackwood's once loyal operative, that the room collectively held its breath. Crow was a key figure in executing Blackwood's plans: intimidation, bribery, sabotage. He's done it all. And he's provided us with names of officers, city council members, and corporate executives who have conspired together to maintain their grip on this city. The silence in the room was deafening. Then the questions started shouted from every corner of the room, overlapping, urgent. Mr. West, what does this mean for the police department? Is the mayor involved? Who else knew about this? Jamal raised a hand, calling for calm. I know you all have questions, and believe me, so do I. That's why today I am calling for an immediate and independent investigation into the police department and every entity implicated in these documents. This is no longer just a legal matter. This is a matter of public trust. The impact of his words rippled through the room like a shockwave. But Jamal wasn't finished. He reached for the final piece of evidence, a recorded phone call sent to him just hours before the press conference. He hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the play button. Then he steeled himself and pressed it. A voice crackled to life over the speakers. It was deep, cold, dripping with condescension. You think this is over, Wes? You think you've won because you have a few pieces of paper? You have no idea who you're dealing with? Walk away now, and maybe I'll let you and your little committee survive this. A murmur ran through the crowd. Jamal's jaw tightened. That voice belonged to none other than Raymond Blackwood. It was the first time the public had heard him, the first time his shadowy presence had been dragged into the light. This, Jamal said quietly, gesturing to the speakers, is what we're up against. A man who believes he is untouchable, a man who has manipulated and threatened his way into power. But today, we say no more. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Reporters scrambled to get the best angles, phones buzzed as the news spread like wildfire, and social media exploded with hashtags expose Blackwood, justice for Jamal, end to corruption. But beyond the frenzy of the media, beyond the flashing cameras and shouting voices, there was something else taking root, a groundswell of anger and resolve among the community. Outside the building, people had gathered in the hundreds, spilling out onto the steps of City Hall, holding signs that read "Clean House Now" and "We Demand Accountability" chants filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. No justice, no peace, no justice, no peace. Jamal turned and looked out at the crowd through the tall windows, his heart swelling with a fierce pride. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was their fight, the community's fight. They had been pushed too far, lied to too many times, and now they were pushing back. As the press conference wound down, Jamal stepped aside to let Marcus take the podium. His ally's voice rang out strong and unyielding. We will not rest until every person responsible is held accountable. We will not be intimidated. We will not back down. Today is the day we take our city back. The roar from the crowd outside was deafening. But even as the public rallied to his side, Jamal knew that the real battle was only just beginning. Blackwood and his backers would not go quietly. There would be backlash, retaliation. The smear campaigns would intensify and the threats would escalate. But they had crossed the line, exposed themselves to the world, and once the light of truth had been shown, it couldn't be dimmed. Jamal West had spent years fighting for justice. Now, for the first time, he had the people behind him and the evidence to prove every word. Blackwood's empire of lies was beginning to crumble, and Jamal was determined to be there when it finally collapsed. This city belongs to the people, Jamal said quietly, almost to himself, as the press conference ended and the room began to empty. Not to the men in shadows, not anymore. But with the community's support, he knew they could do it. They could break the chains that had bound the city for so long. Today was just the beginning. As he stepped out into the sunlight and the crowd surged around him, cheering and chanting his name, Jamal West felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Oh, and this time he wasn't going to let go. The roar of applause and shouts of support reverberated through the packed hall as Jamal West stepped back from the podium, the echoes of his declaration still ringing in his ears. Justice will be served no matter who stands in our way. The words had been spoken with a fierce resolve, a promise to a community that had been bruised and battered, yet still stood defiant. The press conference was over, the truth was out, and the city was ablaze with the fallout of his revelations. But as the crowds outside continued to chant his name, their voices carrying through the crisp evening air, Jamal King with chilling certainty this was far from over. Exposing Blackwood's network of corruption was just the beginning. Unseating a system built on decades of manipulation and fear would take more than a few headlines and a burst of public outrage. Blackwood was still out there watching, planning, and even now undoubtedly plotting his next move. The thought simmered in the back of his mind as he made his way off the stage, flanked by Marcus and a handful of other allies from the Oversight Committee. The atmosphere backstage was electric, a chaotic mix of triumph and anxiety. Reporters clamored for more interviews, cameras flashed incessantly, and voices overlapped in a cacophony of questions. But Jamal's eyes were distant, his mind racing ahead, already anticipating the battles yet to come. "Jamal, you did it," Marcus's voice cut through the noise, filled with both admiration and caution. The former detective gripped his shoulder, his expression a blend of pride and wariness. "You finally brought Blackwood into the light?" Into the light, maybe Jamal murmured, his gaze shifting to the throng of people gathered outside the building's tall windows. Signs waved back and forth, fists pumped the air, and chants of no justice, no peace rang out, powerful and insistent. But he's not out of the game yet. He's wounded, but a wounded predator is the most dangerous kind. Marcus nodded slowly, his face darkening. You think he's going to retaliate? I know he will, Jamal replied, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He'll use every trick he has left, every ally, every threat. He's not just fighting for his survival, he's fighting to maintain a system that benefits far too many people in power. They fell silent for a moment, the enormity of what lay ahead settling between them. The evidence they had revealed today was damning, yes, but Blackwood's network was vast, his reach extending into every corner of the city's political and economic landscape. There would be investigations, lawsuits, and reforms, but Jamal knew that real change would not come without a fight, a long, grueling fight against forces that would stop at nothing to preserve the status quo. Then we'll fight, Marcus said quietly, a steely determination hardening his voice. We'll dig deeper, go after every lead, every connection. We'll drag every one of his collaborators into the light one by one. Jamal looked at his friend, his partner in this relentless pursuit of justice, and nodded. Yes, we will, because we owe it to every person who has been wronged, every life destroyed by this corruption. This isn't just about Blackwood anymore. This is about making sure that no one else ever has to face what we faced. With that resolve, they turned and began planning their next steps. The team gathered in a small room, papers and laptops strewn across a long table, voices low but urgent. They mapped out their strategy, contacting federal agencies to expand the investigation, rallying community support to keep the pressure on local officials, and reaching out to potential allies in other cities where Blackwood's influence might extend. It was overwhelming, the sheer scale of the task ahead daunting, even to the most seasoned of activists. But amidst the tension, there was also a palpable sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, they weren't alone. People were watching, listening, ready to act. And as Jamal stood at the head of the table, watching his team work, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel in months: belief that they could actually win this. Hours later, long after the press conference had ended and the building had emptied out, Jamal found himself alone on the rooftop, staring out over the glittering city skyline. The cold night air whipped around him, tugging at his coat. Below, he could still see clusters of people gathered, their banners and signs illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. The community was still awake, still vigilant. But somewhere out there, so was Blackwood. Jamal's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen, an unknown number. His pulse quickened as he hesitated, then tapped to answer. Jamal West came a smooth, almost amused voice. It was unmistakable, the voice from the recording, the voice of the man who had orchestrated so much pain and suffering. Raymond Blackwood, quite the performance today. I must say, you certainly know how to put on a show. Jamal's grip tightened around the phone. It's not a show, Blackwood. It's the beginning of the end for you. A low chuckle echoed through the line. Oh, is that what you think? That exposing a few emails and some dirty secrets will bring me down? You're more naive than I thought. You merely clipped a few branches, West. But the roots run deep, deeper than you can imagine. Then we'll tear him out, Jamal shot back, his voice steady, one by one. There was a pause, and when Blackwood spoke again, his tone was colder, more calculating. I'm offering you a chance, West. Walk away now, and I'll make sure you and your family are left alone. Keep pushing, and, well, let's just say accidents happen even to heroes. Is that a threat, Jamal asked, his voice low and dangerous. It's reality, Blackwood replied softly. You're stepping into a war you can't win. I have the resources, the connections, and the will to outlast you. I am the system, West. And you're just a man with a folder of papers. Jamal felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, but he forced himself to stay calm. You're wrong, Blackwood. I'm a man with a community behind him, and we're not backing down. Not now, not ever. Silence stretched on the line, thick and oppressive. Then, almost lazily, Blackwood sighed. Very well, if that's your choice, I suppose we'll see just how far you're willing to go. The line went dead, leaving Jamal standing alone in the dark, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on him. He knew Blackwood meant every word. There would be more threats, more attempts to undermine everything they were building. But for the first time, he felt no fear, only resolve. Because the people were awake now, and together they would face whatever came next. They would dig in, fight back, and keep pushing until the system that had oppressed them for so long was dismantled piece by piece. This battle was just beginning. But Jamal West, armed with the truth and the will of a community determined to see justice done, was ready for it. With a final glance out over the city, he turned and headed back inside. There was no time to rest, no time to waver. The fight for justice was long, grueling, and unrelenting, but it was a fight worth having. And Jamal West, a warrior for change, would see it through to the very end.